provided by Stop to Heal, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is a publication by the American Psychiatric Association for the classification of mental disorders using a common language and standard criteria, and is the main book for the diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders all around the globe and is considered one of the Bibles of psychologists. The DSM evolved from systems for collecting census and psychiatric hospital statistics, as well as from the United States Army Manual. It is used by researchers, psychiatric drug regulation agencies, health insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, the legal system, and policymakers. Mental health professionals use the manual to determine and help communicate a patient's diagnosis after an evaluation. The DSM-I. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders was approved in 1951 and published in 1952. The structure and conceptual framework were the same as in Medical 203. Revisions since its first publication in 1952 have incrementally added to the total number of mental disorders, while removing those no longer considered to be mental disorders. The manual was 132 pages long and listed 106 mental disorders. These included several categories of personality disturbance, generally distinguished from neurosis. Later in the same year, the APA listed homosexuality in the DSM as a sociopathic personality disturbance. The large-scale study in 1962 of homosexuality was used to justify inclusion of the disorder as a supposed pathological hidden fear of the opposite sex caused by traumatic parent-child relationships. This view was influential in the medical profession. The DSM-II. In the 1960s, there were many challenges to the concept of mental illness itself. These challenges came from psychiatrists who argued mental illness was a myth used to disguise moral conflicts. The APA was closely involved in the next significant revision of the mental disorder section of the ICD version 8, published in 1968. It decided to go ahead with the revision of the DSM, which was published in 1968. DSM-II was similar to DSM-I, listed 182 disorders and was 134 pages long. The term reaction was dropped, but the term neurosis was retained. Both the DSM-I and the DSM-II reflected the predominant psychodynamic psychiatry, although both manuals also included biological perspectives and concepts. Symptoms were not specified in details for specific disorders. Many were seen as reflections of broad underlying conflicts or maladaptive reactions to life problems that were rooted in a distinction between neurosis and psychosis. An influential 1974 paper by Robert Spitzer demonstrated that the second edition of the DSM was an unreliable diagnostic tool. Spitzer found that the different practitioners using the DSM rarely agreed when diagnosing patients with similar problems. In reviewing previous studies of 18 major diagnostic categories, Spitzer concluded that there are no diagnostic categories for which reliability is uniformly high. Reliability appears to be only satisfactory for three categories: mental deficiency, organic brain syndrome, and alcoholism. The level of reliability is no better than fair for psychosis and schizophrenia and is poor for the remaining categories. The DSM-III. In 1974, the decision to create a new revision of the DSM was made, and Robert Spitzer was selected as the chairman of the task force. One added goal was to improve the uniformity and validity of the psychiatric diagnosis in the wake of a number of critiques. There was also felt a need to standardize diagnostic practices within the United States and with other countries after research showed that psychiatric diagnosis differed between Europe and the United States. The first draft of DSM-III was ready within a year. It introduced many new categories of disorder while deleting or changing others. A controversy emerged regarding deletion of the concept of neurosis, a mainstream of psychoanalytic theory and therapy, but seen as a vague and unscientific by the DSM task force. Faced with enormous political opposition, DSM-III was in serious danger of not being approved by the APA Board of Trustees unless neurosis was included in some form A political compromise reinserted the term in parentheses after the word disorder in some cases. Additionally, the diagnosis of ego-dystonic homosexuality replaced the DSM-II category of sexual orientation disturbance. The gender identity disorder in children (GIDC) diagnosis was introduced in the DSM-III prior to the DSM-III's publication in 1980. There was no diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria. Finally published in 1980, DSM-III listed 265 diagnostic categories and was 494 pages long, rapidly came into widespread international use, and has been termed as a revolution or transformation in the field of psychiatry. Then came the DSM-III-R, the revised version. In 1987, DSM-III-R was published as a revision of the DSM-III under the direction of Spitzer. Categories were renamed and reorganized with significant changes in the criteria. 6 categories were deleted, while others were added. Controversial diagnoses such as premenstrual dysphoria disorder and masochistic personality disorder was considered and discarded. Ego-dystonic homosexuality was also removed and was largely subsumed under sexual disorder not otherwise specified, which could include persistent and marked distress about one's sexual orientation. Altogether, the DSM-III-R contained 292 diagnoses and was 567 pages long. Then came the DSM-IV. In 1994, the DSM-IV was published listing 410 disorders in 886 pages. The task force was chaired by the Ellen Francis and was overseen by a steering committee of 27 people, including 4 psychologists. The steering committee created 13 work groups of 5 to 16 members, each work group having about 20 advisors in addition. The work group conducted a 3-step process. First, each group conducted an extensive literature review for the diagnosis. Then, they requested the data from researchers, conducting analysis to determine which criteria required change, with instructions to be conservative. Finally, they conducted multi-center field trials relating diagnosis to clinical practice. A major change from previous version was the inclusion of a clinical significance criterion. Almost half of all the categories which required symptoms causing clinically significant distress or impairment in social or occupational or other important areas of functioning. Some personality disorder diagnoses were deleted or moved to the appendix. The DSM-IV was organized into a 5-part axial system. Axis 1 provided information about clinical disorders or any mental condition other than personality disorders and what was referred to in DSM edition prior to DSM-5 as mental retardation or MR. Axis 3 covered medical conditions that could impact a person's disorder or treatment of a disorder, and Axis 4 covered psychosocial and environmental factors affecting the person. Axis 5 was the GAF, or Global Assessment of Functioning, which was basically a numerical score between 0 and 100 that measured how much a person's psychological symptoms impacted their daily life. There were source books also present for the 4th edition. The DSM-IV does not specifically cite its sources, but there are 4 volumes of source books intended to be APS documentation of the guideline development process and supporting evidence, including literature reviews, data analysis, and field trials. The source books have been said to provide important insight into the character and quality of the decisions that led to the production of DSM-IV and the scientific credibility of contemporary psychiatric classification. Then came the DSM-V. For the first time, Roman numbering was changed into numeric. DSM-V got approved on December 2012 and was published on May 18, 2013. DSM-V contains extensively revised diagnoses and in some cases broadens diagnostic definition while narrowing definitions in other cases. A significant change in the 5th edition is the deletion of the subtypes of schizophrenia: paranoid, disorganized, catatonic, undifferentiated, and residual. The deletion of the subsets of autistic spectrum disorder, namely Asperger's syndrome's classic autism, Rett syndrome, etc., were not otherwise specified, was also implemented with specifiers regarding intensity like mild, moderate, and severe. Severity is based on social communication impairments and restricted repetitive behaviors of behavior, with three levels: requiring support, requiring substantial support, and requiring very substantial support. The latest version of DSM is a revision of DSM-5 titled DSM-5 TR, was published in March 2022, updating diagnostic criteria and ICD-10 CM codes. The diagnostic criteria for the wide and restrictive food intake disorder was changed, along with adding entries for prolonged grief disorder, unspecified mood disorder, and stimulant-induced mild neurocognitive disorder. There are some other changes as well made in the DSM, the disorders, which will be shared in details in the video of DSM-5. So keep watching this channel. Don't forget to like,